All right, good morning once again. If you would open your Bible to the book of 1 Samuel, chapter 22. This morning, we are going to be in verses 6 through 23. We will finish the chapter. Last week, we looked at just verses 1 to 5, a short story, and this morning we have a little bit of a longer story. So I'll be reading the text as I go through in the exposition. I won't read it up front just because it's a little bit longer. And then after the exposition, I'll give us application of the text. The title of the sermon this morning is a very common question, one that I will not exhaustively answer in any stretch of the imagination, of why does God allow such evil in this world? Not just why does God allow evil, but why does God allow such evil in this world? So if you will, open with me with a word of prayer and pray alongside me, and then we will read the text as we go through it. So if you will pray with me. Lord, as we look at just a very low point in the history of Israel, God, we're reminded of just how low sin can bring humanity. And God, you have generation after generation, as you have reigned over this world, have witnessed unspeakable evil. You have sat on your throne and watched as we, as humans, have just committed atrocities that we can't even begin to put words to. I know, God, that many of us, maybe all of us, have asked this question at some point. Why? Why, God, have you allowed such evil in this world? And I pray, Lord, this morning you would help us to see that in the midst of unspeakable evil, you are still reigning. You are still in control, and that none of it goes beyond your notice, and that you will deal with it accordingly. I pray this in the name of Jesus. Amen. We are jumping into the middle of a story, and especially if you're visiting with us this morning, we're jumping into the middle of a book. And so let me give the context to kind of bring us up to speed real quickly, and then we'll begin looking at our text. In this book of 1 Samuel, King Saul is the king of Israel. David has been anointed the new king, but he has not taken reign yet. When David found out that King Saul wanted him dead, David has to flee. And so he's on the run. The first place he went was Nob. He went to the tabernacle of Nob, and there he meets with Ahimelech. And when he gets there, Ahimelech gives him bread and the sword of Goliath. And we read that story a few weeks ago. There was a parenthetical there that if you remember, I told you to keep in mind. Here it is. Now, a certain man of the servants of Saul was there that day, the day that David went to Nob. He was detained before the Lord. His name was Doeg, the Edomite, the chief of Saul's herdsmen. If you remember, I told you, keep that parenthetical in mind. You kind of wonder, like, at the time, why did he give this detail? We're going to find out this morning why the narrator gave us that detail. So let's read our text. I'll give an exposition and then I'll give application. 1 Samuel 22, let's start in verse 6. We'll go to verse 8 to start off with. Now Saul heard that David was discovered and the men who were with him. Saul was sitting at Gibeah under the tamarisk tree on the height with his spear in his hand, and all his servants were standing about him. And Saul said to his servants who stood about him, "Hear now, people of Benjamin. Will the son of Jesse give every one of you fields and vineyards? Will he make you all commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds, that all of you have conspired against me? No one discloses it to me when my son makes a covenant with the son of Jesse. None of you is sorry for me or discloses to me that my son has stirred up my servant against me to lie in wait as this day." We'll stop right there. So we see in this text here that word gets back to Saul that David and his 400 men have been discovered. If you remember David in the cave of Adullam, 400 men had joined him, and he's hiding. But word gets back to Saul that David and his 400 men, they've been discovered. And here is Saul when he finds out this news, and he's sitting under this tree and he's got a spear in his hand. It was always a dangerous thing to be around Saul when he had a spear in his hand. He had already thrown it 3 times at David, trying to kill him. He had even thrown it at his own son, Jonathan, presumably to put his own son to death. But this time, instead of throwing the spear, Saul pulls out the violin. Except it's not a sad violin. It's an angry violin. It's a self-pitying violin. He says, will the son of Jesse, notice he still can't call him by name. Saul will not refer to him as David. He keeps referring to him as son of Jesse. Will the son of Jesse make you rich? Will he give you power and esteem? Apparently Saul had made the people of Benjamin. Notice he refers to them as Benjaminites. That seems to imply here that Saul had given his kinsmen, because remember, Saul's a Benjaminite. That was very common for kings to do. He had given his own clansmen power and esteem. And he uses that leverage to bring a guilt trip upon his servants. Notice what Saul says. He says, all of you have conspired against me. They didn't conspire against you, Saul. He says, no one discloses to me when my son makes a covenant with the son of Jesse. Now, in Saul's twisted mind, this is tantamount to treason. Not only has Jonathan committed treason, but so has all of his servants who hid the matter from him. And then Saul, man, he really starts to play the violin. None of you is sorry for me. Literally, none of you feels ill for me. None of you discloses it to me that my son has stirred up my servant against me. Again, not true. Jonathan didn't stir up David against him. Saul continues to distort the truth. And notice, what does David think that Saul is doing while he's in hiding? He says, to lie in wait as at this day. What does that mean? The Net Bible translates it this: to hide in ambush against me, as is the case today. Saul is convinced that David is hiding because he's plotting an ambush against him. Why else would he be hiding? Why else would he have these 400 men with him? Verses 9 to 10. Then answered Doeg the Edomite, who stood by the servants of Saul. I saw the son of Jesse come into Nob to Ahimelech the son of Ahitub, and he inquired of the Lord for him and gave him provisions and gave him the sword of Goliath the Philistine. There we go. Remember Doeg? Remember Doeg the Edomite? We saw him a few weeks ago. He was at the tabernacle at Nob. What was he doing there? He was detained before the Lord, perhaps as a punishment. Now, here's an interesting question. Would the rest of this story have happened had Doeg not been there that day? The only people who knew about what happened that day was David, Ahimelech, and Doeg. Ironically, Doeg was detained before the Lord. So God in his providence ordained that Doeg would be there at the tabernacle on that day in this city at the exact time that Ahimelech helped David. Now, we quickly get the impression that Doeg is just a scumbag. He's the kind of guy that would sell you out in a heartbeat if he thought it would advance him. Doeg is not going to waste a good opportunity to get on the king's good side, perhaps get some riches while he's at it. He sells David out and tells Saul about what he witnessed. Doeg gives us one more piece of information that we didn't have before. He says, Ahimelech, when David went there, inquired of the Lord for David. So Ahimelech not only gave David bread, not only did he give him a sword, but he also gave him direction from the Lord. So what is Saul going to do with this newfound knowledge? What's he going to do with it? Look at verse 11 to 13. Then the king sent to summon Ahimelech the priest, the son of Ahitub, and all his father's house. The priests who were at Nob, and all of them came to the king, and Saul said, "Hear now, son of Ahitub." And he answered, "Here I am, my lord." And Saul said to him, "Why have you conspired against me, you and the son of Jesse, and that you have given him bread and a sword, and have inquired of God for him, so that he has risen against me to lie in wait, as at this day?" So Saul summons everybody. He tells Ahimelech and all his father's house. What does that mean? All the priests of Nob. He summons them all. They all come to the king. Notice, they don't run and hide. As far as they're concerned, they've done nothing wrong. Saul calls out Ahimelech by name. He says, "Ahimelech, the son of Ahitub." And Ahimelech, he's not hiding. He says, "Here I am, my lord." And Saul continues to distort the truth. Saul says, why have you conspired against me? Ahimelech didn't conspire against Saul. But in Saul's mind, this bread, this sword, this direction from the Lord is aiding and abetting David's coup d'etat. Saul's paranoia has taken full hold of him. Look at verse 14 to 15. Then Ahimelech answered the king, and who among all your servants is so faithful as David, who is the king's son-in-law and captain over your bodyguard and honored in your house? Is today the first time that I've inquired of God for him? No. Let not the king impute anything to his servant, to all the house of my father. For your servant has known nothing of all this, much or little. So Ahimelech is not afraid to speak the truth to the king. The king may no longer recognize truth, but that's not going to keep Ahimelech from speaking truth to the king. He says, who among all your servants is as so faithful as David? That was the tragic truth. There was no servant of Saul that was as faithful as David. When Saul required 100 foreskins of the Philistines, David went out and got 200. Ahimelech reminds Saul that David is your family. He married your daughter. He is your son-in-law. He's also captain of your bodyguard. That's like the Secret Service. David is the captain of Saul's Secret Service, meaning he would die to protect you, Saul. David is honored in your house. He's highly respected among your family and your friends and your soldiers. And then Ahimelech pleads his innocence. He says, look, was that day that I inquired of God? Was that the first time that I did this? In other words, Ahimelech is saying, look, this was not part of some elaborate plot to overthrow you. I only did for David what I've always done for David. This is not like the first time he came to me. I've always inquired for David. No doubt that every time David went into battle, he would inquire of the Lord, and perhaps he went to Ahimelech before and inquired. And so he says, look, let not the king accuse me of betraying you. I know nothing of this ambush that you speak of, either in part or in whole. Now, you get the sense that Ahimelech realizes that his life is in jeopardy. Look at verse 16 to 17. And the king said, you shall surely die, Ahimelech, you and all your father's house. And the king said to the guard who stood about him, turn and kill the priests of the Lord, because their hand also was with David. And they knew that he fled and did not disclose it to me. But the servants of the king would not put out their hand to strike the priests of the Lord. Stop there. Saul's just turned to complete madness at this point. David may be pretending to be an insane man, but Saul literally has gone mad at this point. Saul says that Ahimelech, the priest of the Lord, shall die. And not only him, but all his father's house. He gives a direct command to the guard, kill the priest of the Lord. Why? Because their hand is with David. Meaning they have chosen their side and they've sided with David. They knew he fled and they didn't tell me. Now, in a stunning statement, though, the narrator tells us that the servants of Saul, they would not obey his command. They would not kill the priests of the Lord. For the second time, Saul is given a direct order to kill someone, and it wasn't obeyed. Remember, Saul ordered his men to kill Jonathan for tasting the honey, and his men overruled him? There is still sanity in Saul's court, just not with Saul. Now, the fact that Saul's servants would not kill the priests of the Lord, I want us to consider what an enormous moment of grace this is for Saul. When they said, no, we will not do this, that's an opportunity. That is God's grace in his life. It's an opportunity for Saul to take a step back and to see the madness of his decision. Now, is Saul going to do that? Is Saul going to take that step back? Look at verse 18 to 19. Then the king said to Doeg, you turn and strike the priests. And Doeg the Edomite turned and struck down the priests, and he killed on that day 85 persons who wore the linen ephod. And Nob, the city of the priest, he put to the sword, both man and woman, child and infant, ox, donkey, and sheep he put to the sword. No, Saul does not take a step back. In fact, he actually takes a step forward, right into the pit of evil. Saul turns to Doeg the Edomite. You turn and strike the priests. And without blinking an eye, Doeg the Edomite pulls out his sword and kills 85 priests. Now the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, gives the number 305. Josephus gives us the number 385. I don't know which is correct. It doesn't really matter. 85 is one is too many. Can you imagine if they rounded up 85 pastors here in America and killed them? We might multiply that number by 10 or maybe 100 for population growth. You imagine if right now the United States government said, bring me 850 pastors and slaughter them before me. Can you imagine that? This is about as low as it gets in Israelite history. It's up there. It's up there with Manasseh's child sacrifices. And as if the blood of 85 priests was not enough, as if that was not evil enough, Doeg goes to Nob, I assume under orders of Saul, and he killed both man and woman, child and infant, ox, donkey, and sheep, women, children, infants. Saul has declared them harem, devoted to destruction. The people asked for a king who would judge them like the nations. They got exactly what they asked for. Here's what's so tragic about all of this. Previously, Saul was given a direct command from the Lord. 1 Samuel 15:3. Now go and strike Amalek and devote to destruction all that they have. Do not spare them, but kill both man and woman, child and infant, ox, sheep, donkey, and camel. This harem was a command from the Lord, a command that Saul failed to obey. But when it came to his command, his wishes, when he wanted these people to be declared harem, the command was fulfilled. Doeg obeyed a wicked king's wicked decree better than Saul obeyed a righteous king's righteous decree. Now just think about that. Verse 20 to 23. But one of the sons of Ahimelech, the son of Ahitub, named Abiathar, escaped and fled after David. And Abiathar told David that Saul had killed the priests of the Lord. And David said to Abiathar, I knew on that day when Doeg the Edomite was there that he would surely tell Saul, I have occasioned the death of all the persons of your father's house. Stay with me. Do not be afraid, for he who seeks my life seeks your life. With me you shall be in safekeeping. How many times did God preserve an individual in the midst of a genocide? Moses, Joash, Esther in a potential genocide, Jesus, and here Abiathar. Abiathar escapes this priestly genocide, this genocide of the city of Nob. He flees to David, and David tells him all that happened. And David says, I knew it. I knew it. I knew when I saw Doeg that day, he would tell Saul. But I want you to notice David's humility. He doesn't immediately get angry, as far as we know. He doesn't even blame Doeg or Saul. Who does he blame? Himself. He says, I have occasioned the death of everyone in your house. The Septuagint translates it as, I am guilty of the death of everyone in your house. Now, to be sure, David is not guilty of their deaths. He's not. But he humbly realizes that his actions, in part, led to their death. And so David tells Abiathar, stay with me. Do not be afraid. We're on the same side. The same man seeks both of our lives. With me, you shall be in safe keeping. We'll stop there with our exposition. Application. I have 8 points of application. I thought about doing the entire sermon on just the theme of why does God allow such evil, but that's probably more of a Friday night topic, which we can do if you want. So here's 8 points of application from the text. Number 1, sin can easily cause the truth to be distorted. Sin can easily cause the truth to be distorted. We've already seen that Saul's sin caused his emotions to be distorted. We talked about that in a sermon a few weeks, maybe months ago, where Saul's sin causes his emotions to be distorted. He goes on this emotional roller coaster of anger and jealousy and fear and paranoia and all this stuff. And now we see that his sin causes his view of the truth to be distorted. He accuses his own men of us conspiring against him. He accuses his own son of stirring up David against him. He accuses David of lying in ambush against him. He accuses Ahimelech of conspiring against him. He even accuses all the priests of throwing in their lot with David. Saul's sin has caused his perception of the truth to be distorted. That's what sin does. It distorts the truth. Now, this can happen in any number of ways. Sin can cause us to believe things about people that are not true. We can easily begin to think the worst of others. We can easily begin to think the worst of their motives. We begin to see everything they do through a distorted filter. Sin causes us to believe things about God that are not true. We can begin to form our theology out of our experience of the world rather than our reading of the Word. We can begin to see God through a distorted filter. A few months ago, I was driving at night. It was raining pretty hard, and I was confused as to why it was difficult for me to see the road. My first thought was like, oh gosh, it's happening. I'm 40. Oh, I had this midlife crisis, this 10-second midlife crisis in a moment. But then I calmed down, and after I got home, I checked my records, and I realized I hadn't changed my windshield wiper blades in almost 3 years. And so while the old blades did remove some of the rain, they weren't very effective. They did a poor job of helping me to see the road. That's what sin does. God sends us rain, trials, stress, affliction, pain, suffering, conflict. And our sin operates like these 3-year-old wiper blades. It distorts our view of the truth. You say, well, what do we do? Replace the blades. Replace the blades. Renew our minds. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind. We must renew our minds. 2, the problem with self-pity is that 100% of the pity is about self. The problem with self-pity is that 100% of the pity is about self. Look at verse 8. That all of you have conspired against me No one discloses it to me when my son makes a covenant with the son of Jesse. None of you is sorry for me or discloses to me that my son has stirred up my servant against me to lie in wait as this day. Now, did you notice what word occurs 5 times in this verse? The first is to recognize it, shout it out. Me. Me, 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 me. Therein lies the central problem with self-pity. 100% of the pity is about self. Self-pity is a form of pride. It is. There are 2 main forms of pride: arrogance and self-pity. Arrogance is an inflated ego. Self-pity is a wounded ego. They're both equally pride. And the thing is, no one is immune from self-pity. We all know this. It doesn't matter how powerful you are. It doesn't matter how successful you are. Saul is the king. It doesn't get any higher than that. And he still is wallowing in self-pity. At the root of self-pity is an expectation that I should be treated a certain way. I should be respected. I should be acknowledged or praised or admired or thanked or recognized or utilized or appreciated. And when that doesn't happen, I throw a party with an invitation list of 1. I have only, as one who struggles a lot with self-pity, because I struggle a lot with pride, I have only ever found one antidote to self-pity: humility. You might say, well, it's kind of simple, Matt. Right? Yeah. Humility. Whenever you find yourself wallowing in self-pity, my wife doesn't respect me the way that I think she should. My husband doesn't love me the way that I think he should. You don't understand how difficult this is. You don't know what it's like. This is humility. Humility. I don't deserve to be treated anyway. I don't deserve anything. I don't deserve to be treated any way. Now, let me just say one thing, because, guys, there's a difference between a counseling session and a sermon, all right? If you come in for counseling, I'm not going to, tell you that. Counseling is like a full hour on that one topic. This is a sermon, not a counseling session. Just want to make sure I clarify that. There's much more to say to that. Number 3, there is no bad luck, accidents, or coincidences within God's providence, including evil. There is no bad luck or accidents or coincidences within God's providence, including evil. How is it that Doeg just happens to be detained before the Lord on this day, in this tabernacle, on this city? I wonder, how long was he detained there? What if it was just one day? You ever think about that? What if Doeg was detained before the Lord for one day? What if it would just happen to be on the exact same day that David came to the tabernacle to get some bread? Talk about bad luck. Talk about a bad coincidence. But the reality is, there is no bad luck. There are no accidents. There are no coincidences not within God's providence. And that includes evil. I believe that sometimes when bad things happen or seemingly accidents happen or coincidences, what happens? We sometimes can become deists. deist. You say, what is deist? Deism is a doctrine which says that God basically sets this universe like a watch. He winds it up. And then he sits back and he just watches, no pun intended. He just lets it unwind. But he's not actively involved in the details. That's what happens whenever accidents happen, coincidences happen, seemingly, just doesn't make any sense. We must fight the temptation to become deist, especially when things don't go our way. You didn't get the house you wanted. You were on your way to put an offer on the house. But someone got there 5 minutes before you. And if you had just gone through that yellow light instead of stopping at it, you would have gotten there first. You didn't get the promotion you wanted. You were going into work today to talk to your boss about wanting to apply for this promotion, but you just happened to get sick that morning, and your boss gave the promotion to somebody else. You went skiing that day. You forgot to bring your boots. You slipped on the ice, and you fractured your arm. There are thousands and thousands and thousands of scenarios we can think of. None of it is bad luck. None of it is an accident. None of it is a coincidence within God's providence. All of it, including evil, including grotesque evil like we see here, falls within the providence of God. Doeg's presence there was no accident. It's not as though God all of a sudden was like, this happened, and as Saul turns to Doeg, God was like, oh gosh, I forgot about Doeg. Yeah, he was there too. God knew. God could have struck Doeg dead. We're going to read in a few weeks or months. Remember Nabal? God just gives him a heart attack and his heart turns to stone. God could have done that to Doeg. He could have turned Doeg's heart to stone. But he doesn't. Doeg's presence there is no accident. It's no bad luck. It's no coincidence. And neither is anything that has ever happened to you. Everything that has happened to you in your life falls within the providence of God. Every single thing, down to the worst thing that's ever happened to you. Four, Jesus is our King. Jesus is our King. I love that when Saul, the king of the land, gives a direct order to his men, turn and kill the priests of the Lord, the servants would not do it. Now, the text doesn't tell us why. They don't give a reason why here. But I believe it's the same reason that the people gave to Saul when he told them to kill Jonathan. This is wrong. This is not God's will. There may come a day in our lifetime. I'm not being exaggerative here, or I'm not trying to be sensational here. There may come a day in our lifetime, or maybe in our children's lifetime, where the government gives us a direct order that if we were to follow it, would be sin. And it's in that moment we will discover who is our King. Jesus is the rightful King. The question is he your King? Friend, would you go to prison for the rest of your life for your King? Friend, would you die for your King? There may come a day where that is put to the test. There may come a day that your children are put to the test. And we will find out And in those moments, if Jesus is your king, he will be your king. You will do as these servants do, and you will not sin against the Lord. 5, mercy is a risk worth taking. Mercy is a risk worth taking. As Ahimelech stood before the king, I wonder what was going through his mind. Did he second guess his decision? Did he think to himself, when he's brought before the king and he sees Saul's spear in his hand and he sees the angry look on Saul's face, did he think, oh gosh, I knew I shouldn't have given that bread? And a sword. What were you thinking, giving a sword? Of course he's going to take this as... No, I don't think so. I don't think that was going through Ahimelech's mind. He doubles down on his actions. He defends David to the king. Sometimes showing mercy is a risk. But it's a risk worth taking. Now, of course, mercy has to be coupled with wisdom. Mercy has to be coupled with wisdom, but not crushed by fear. I was reading an article about why some Christians in Ukraine fled. Once the invasion started, why some Christians in Ukraine fled. Some fled, some stayed. I like that the article did not condemn those who fled. Sometimes the best thing, sometimes the wisest thing is to flee. And I like that it didn't condemn them. But for those who stayed, and there are many who stayed, not necessarily to fight, some maybe to fight, but not necessarily to fight, perhaps to support, perhaps to pray, perhaps to minister. I mean, this war could go on for who knows how long. I mean, are we just going to not have church? Like, if we were invaded, right? Like, are we just not going to have church? Guys, I'll be here. I'll be here. Like, we don't ever cancel service. You guys want to come to church? I mean, we might get bombed, but I'll be here. Some might look at those Christians in Ukraine and say, is that worth the risk? I mean, really, is that worth the risk? Yes. Mercy is a risk worth taking. One of the benefits of reading church history, you say, is there a benefit to reading church history? Yes. One of the benefits of reading church history is that you will see a long line of Christians taking drastic risks in the name of mercy. From disease. I mean, we act like COVID was like the first ever pandemic in the history of the world. There has been horrendous disease, and people continue to minister at risk to their life. Persecution breaks out. Right now, Christians, I'm sure there's at least one Christian in North Korea. Well, probably two. Somebody had to share it with them. And those two Christians, when they meet together to show mercy to each other, is that worth it? Is that worth the risk? Yes, it's worth the risk. The church has a long history of testifying that mercy is worth the risk. 6, humility starts not with you are guilty, but I am guilty. Humility starts not with you are guilty, but I am guilty. Who is to blame for the death of these 85 priests? Who is to blame for the death of this entire town, this men, this women, this children, these infants? Now, we could say Doeg at one level. That would be true at one level. We could say Saul is ultimately to blame, and I think he is. I think he's the one who gave Doeg this order. Even Abiathar, you notice when Abiathar said, Abiathar didn't say that Doeg killed him. He said Saul. He said Saul has killed the priest of the Lord. But look at what David says. David says, I have occasioned the death of all the persons of your father's house. NIV translates as, I am responsible. The Septuagint translates as, I am guilty. Now, this is certainly a case of false guilt. This is definitely a case of false guilt. I don't believe David is guilty of their deaths. Unless, As one commentator said, David felt guilty because he knew he should have put Doeg to death that day. That's a possibility. Maybe he was supposed to put Doeg to death. But I don't know if I buy that. I don't know. What I take away from David's statement is this, his humility. He does not fly off in a rage at Saul. He does not fly off in a rage at Doeg. He starts with himself. Isn't that so hard to do? Especially in the, challenging in the midst of a trial or the middle of conflict. You get in the middle of a conflict. Someone maybe has sinned against you. Could be your roommate, could be your spouse, could be your girlfriend, boyfriend, could be your mom or your dad, could be your child. Right in the midst of a conflict, it's so tempting to start from a place of, you are guilty, you did wrong. But how hard it is to not start there, but to start from a place of, I am guilty. Now, that, I'm using the word start because I am not suggesting that it doesn't mean the other person isn't guilty. Doeg is guilty. Saul is guilty. But humility comes into every conflict, every trial, every offense with a humble acknowledgement. I too stand guilty before the Lord. So that when we talk about this conflict, when we talk about this trial, when we talk about the offense that you caused me, that I start from a place of, I am guilty too. Maybe not of anything in this incident, but as a foundation, I'm coming to you as guilty. Seven, even in the midst of evil and tragedy, God still provides. Even in the midst of evil and tragedy, God still provides. We see a direct contrast between David and Saul. Saul lost his prophet, Samuel. God provided David with the prophet, Gad. Saul has now lost his priest, Ahimelech, and 85 other priests. God has now provided David with his own priest, Abiathar. Even in the midst of this evil and tragedy, God still provides. God provided David to Abiathar to give Abiathar safe refuge, and God provided Abiathar to David. We must consider how gracious this was of the Lord. Next week, we're going to see why God preserved a remnant. Why did God save Abiathar? Why did he do this? Hold your place, look at chapter 23, just real quick. Chapter 23, look at verse 6 and verse 9. I'll read it. Verse 6 and 9. When Abiathar, the son of Ahimelech, had fled to David to Keilah, he had come down with an ephod in his hand. Look at verse 9. David knew that Saul was plotting harm against him, and he said to Abiathar the priest, bring the ephod here. Now, what does that mean? Abiathar just happened to escape with an ephod in his hand. You say, what's that? What? An ephod contained the revelatory Urim and Thummim. You're like, what's that? Remember those magic 8 balls? You turn it over like, will Susie go out with me? Not likely. Okay. Y'all remember those magic 8 balls? You turn it. Y'all looking at me like you never seen that before. You'd ask it a question and they would tell you, right? Of course, that's fake. It's not real. But it was real for them. The Urim and Thummim was how they knew the will of the Lord. Only the priest could do this. The priest had, the Urim and Thummim are like rocks that are in the ephod. The ephod is his breastplate. Abiathar escapes with the ephod so that David now has a means to seek the Lord's will. Can you imagine that when you're in a war, that you had to know every time, like, man, should I go in this battle or not? Because if you make the wrong decision, you might all die. And that God would say, go up. I've given them into your hand. Okay, great. Let's go, guys. Do not go up. I have not given them your hand. Okay, guys, we're staying here. God provides Abiathar for David so that David could know his will. Even in the midst of unspeakable tragedy, God still provided for David. And number 8, last point. Why does God allow such evil in our world, and why doesn't God do something about it? There are 2 questions here. Number 1, why does God allow such evil in our world? Now, there are several answers to this question. Any attempt to reduce this down to a singular answer is an oversimplification. I mean, if you go to YouTube and you type in this question, why is there evil in the world, or why is there so much evil, and the video is anything less than like 7 hours, we always look for like 3-minute videos, like sum this up in 3 minutes. Don't watch those videos. That's an incomplete answer. It's an oversimplification. You cannot answer this question in 3 minutes. So this is not the only answer. It is one answer. Why did God allow Doeg to do this? Why didn't God intervene when he started putting 85 priests to death? He intervened later at David. Remember when the angel of the Lord goes to strike down Jerusalem? He intervened then. Why didn't he intervene now? Why didn't he intervene when he started putting women and children and infants to death? Why? One answer is given to us by the Apostle Paul. 1 Corinthians 10:6. Now these things took place as examples for us, that we might not desire evil as they did. Saul is given to us as an example, as a man who's defined by insecurity, pride, jealousy, anger, self-pity, lies. And he's given to us that we would see this is who we are apart from Jesus Christ. We are meant to look at the story of Saul and be shaken to our core that we would not desire evil as he did. That we would see that apart from Jesus, this is the outcome. Now, that still leaves the question about Doeg. What about Doeg? We never see Doeg again in Scripture. You kind of wonder, Doeg, this guy murdered 85 priests. He murdered an entire town. He killed, these babies and these infants. What about Doeg, Lord? And we never see him again. Why doesn't God do something about Doeg? Because he will. I want to close by reading Psalm 52. Turn with me to Psalm 52. Psalm 52 is a psalm that David is writing, and he writes it to Doeg. To the choir master, a maskil of David, when Doeg the Edomite came and told Saul, David has come to the house of Ahimelech. Why do you boast of evil, O mighty man? The steadfast love of God endures all the day. Your tongue plots destruction like a sharp razor, you worker of deceit. You love evil more than good, and lying more than speaking what is right. You love all words that devour, O deceitful tongue. Here it is. But God will break you down forever. He will snatch and tear you from your tent. He will uproot you from the land of the living. The righteous shall see and fear, and shall laugh at him, saying, see the man who would not make God his refuge, but trusted in the abundance of his riches, and sought refuge in his own destruction. But I am like a green olive tree in the house of God. I trust in the steadfast love of God forever and ever. I will thank you forever because you have done it. I will wait for your name, for it is good in the presence of the godly. Why doesn't God do something about the evil in this world? He will. He will. Let's pray.